Thank you, Lauren. I will say I'm still an attorney and I still represent, that doesn't stop. I still represent 3 youth in foster care that I just couldn't get off my caseload because I adored them too much. So still going to court regularly enough. And I'm also an adjunct professor at Delaware Law School. So I've actually done this presentation numerous times in front of numerous audiences and at national conferences, but I even do it for my law students. So you can all act like law students, but I won't use Socratic method on you today. That means that I have to grill you when I'm done with whatever I ask. I hope that as I'm setting up, you will take time to think through any questions you have, challenge me, ask me anything. But I will tell you, as I'm getting set up, when I first started learning about trauma, it was an aha moment for me. It helped me understand why my clients act the way they act and why families and parents sometimes act the way they act. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. Let me just make sure I have the correct one. Okay, what do you see? You see my notes page. Hold on, I got to redo this.
No, we don't. We're good. We see your PowerPoint.
Oh, you don't see the 2 screens, the second page, which is, it has learning objectives on the side?
Nope.
Okay, great. I did it correctly then. I have 3 screens. I told Lauren I have 2, but I actually have 3 screens. And so sometimes what I'm seeing isn't what I can tell. So I ask my law students all the time, like, are you seeing the same thing I'm seeing? Okay, so as Lauren said, I currently work for Children and Families First. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer, and that's kind of like a everything but the kitchen sink position. I do a lot of legal compliance issues, but I also have helped Children and Families First launch their Head Start program. I'm also involved in a lot of their trauma-informed care, brain science work, their equity, diversity, inclusion work, and a smattering of other things that I oversee as well. Has anybody, before we get started, has anyone had any training on trauma before? A couple of, Jessica has. Jessica, you seem very familiar to me, but probably because they poached you from DFS or something like that, right?
I was at Children and Families First. I actually just came to OCA this week.
Oh, that's how I know your name.
I was in fair.
Okay, so CFF poached me and then OCA poached you. It must have been a fair trade then.
I don't know about that, but I'll go with it.
Okay, so Jessica is going to be my star student then. I'm going to pick on you occasionally, right?
Okay.
And any of you who haven't, like I said, please ask lots of questions. This is what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to help you understand what trauma is, how it impacts the brain and changes behavior, and then give you some strategies and tools for how you can work with your young people who have all experienced trauma. And I will say, when I was at the Office of the Child Advocate for almost 10 years as a child attorney, and before that, I was also a parent attorney. I worked for Community Legal Aid Society. So I have perspective from both angles. And I think the greatest thing that learning about trauma has done for me is it helped me look at families as there's great opportunity and strength for them, that no parent is a bad parent. It just, they've had some really difficult circumstances. And if you can look at parents from that perspective, you can start to understand. If I can't necessarily walk in everyone's shoes, but if I understood what happened to them in their childhood or as they're trying to raise their children, that they don't have the same skill set. And maybe if any of you have been parents and you're at the end of your rope, you probably have all had that opportunity to either have a support system or to say, I need to take a 5-minute break and tap out. And a lot of times people who don't have the same kinds of support systems or coping skills don't have that ability to tap out and say, okay, I need to take a break. And oftentimes that's when kids can be harmed. So if you just look at it from that perspective, that most parents are fairly well-intentioned. I won't say all, because I also specialized in serious injury cases, but 95% of our parents are just doing the best they can with what they've got. Okay, and here's my PSA for all of you, my public service announcement, that talking about trauma is difficult. Many of us on this Zoom call, I used to say many of us in the room, but now we're all virtual. many of us on the Zoom call have experienced some form of trauma, either in our childhood or even as adults. And so please give yourself permission to check out for a little bit. I'm okay with that. Take your computer off, your video, whatever you need to make yourself feel comfortable. Not only is this important because I certainly don't want to re-trigger any trauma you might have, but also use this as an opportunity to model good behavior and good choices, because all the clients that you represent have experienced some kind of trauma. And so if you can say, I need to check out because this is really difficult for me, you can model that kind of behavior for your young people as well and say, that's okay to do. And it's actually really encouraged to do. So take a break if you need to. Okay, let's start off. What is trauma? So the first thing we need to do is define things. And I will tell you, I am not a slide reader. So Lauren has the presentation. She can share it with you. I try to just have the slides so you don't have to just stare at me or the other people on Zoom. But what trauma really is the 3 E's. It's the event, it's the experience, and then it's the effect of that event. And no event impacts people the same. So everyone can have a different kind of reaction or experience from something traumatic. I'll give you a quick example that one of my mentors and colleagues used once, and I thought, this is such a perfect example, I'm stealing it from her. She was doing a training in New York City in a high-rise building, and the fire alarm went off. And when the fire alarm went off, some people orderly walked out of their New York City skyscraper building, down the stairs to the exit, and other people were freaking out. Anyone want to guess why the same exact event happened, the fire alarm went off, and people reacted differently? You can go off mute if you want to participate.
Previous experience.
What kind of previous experience?
Well, negative previous experience of the sounds and the panic.
Mm-hmm. Is there something in particular about New York City and fire alarms going off that might have triggered this for some people?
Maybe 9/11.
Exactly, yeah. So she did a training 5 years after 9/11, and when people heard the sirens and the fire alarm go off, some people who had been in New York in 9/11, it triggered that emotion for them, whereas others were like, oh, it's just a fire alarm, let me just take the stairs out. So I use that example to say that no two people experience a traumatic event the same way. And I want you to understand that, because sometimes you might see something as not a big deal and someone else thinks it's a bigger deal. If any of you have been in a relationship with someone or a best friend or a family member and you say, why are they reacting that way? Because people's brains and their nervous systems react differently to different kinds of stressors. There are different kinds of trauma. So you can see on the bottom, we're going to go through a couple examples of what different kinds of trauma there are. Anyone want to give me an example of what an acute trauma is?
Car accident.
Perfect. That is the example I love to use. The most horrible thing, I shouldn't say I love it. An acute trauma is a one-time event, a car accident. Really, really stressful in the moment, but hopefully if it's not catastrophic, you might have some injuries, you can recover, your car can get worked on, and then you move forward. It's a hassle for a bunch of days when you have a rental car, but you move forward from it. One-time event. Chronic trauma, what's that?
Abuse?
Yep, abuse. Anyone else have an example? What kind of abuse?
Physical?
Yeah,
Emotional?
physical abuse. Anyone else have an example of chronic trauma?
Experiencing earthquakes.
That's sort of debatable, unless you live in like the San Fernando Valley where there are multiple earthquakes. But generally speaking, chronic are long time, frequently repeated kinds of trauma. So having a parent with a mental illness or a chronic illness, being long-term sexually abused or physically abused, those are all chronic traumas. How about complex trauma? What's that? I've been told to count to 10 when I'm on Zoom, because it takes people 7 seconds to process and then an extra 3 seconds to find their unmute.
Not simple, complex. One thing that happens after the other, overwhelming series of traumatic events. Well,
Yes, exactly. Thank you. Yes. So a good friend of mine, Dr. J, who I work with at Children and Families First, he and I do trainings together. And when he started doing therapy for children or families, the child would come in and he would look at the piece of paper that says, Timmy's here because mom and dad are getting divorced, or Timmy's here because he's being bullied. And what he'd start to realize is that most kids don't just have one traumatic thing happen. It's layer upon layer upon layer of chronic types of trauma. So you have a child whose parent is using substances and they're being neglected and they're being bullied at school and their dad's incarcerated. So it's layer upon layer of long-term chronic traumas. What about historical trauma? Anyone know what that is?
Cultural, perhaps racial, all these kinds of traumas, yes.
Right. We're going to talk a little bit about discrimination, but we live in a country where we're going through, I think, what I call a racial reckoning right now. And we see this all the time, that oftentimes our Black and African American friends, neighbors, and community members are getting targeted for discrimination by police or others. There's systemic oppression. So there's historical trauma, and there's actually a medical issue related to long-term historical trauma. Intergenerational trauma can be passed down from genes, and I'm going to show you a video about this. We can talk about this if anyone's interested, but it's called epigenetics. It's where your genes and the trauma you experience can be passed down to the next generation. And what about vicarious trauma?
When you experience it in your imagination, especially if you're very high in moral reasoning, so the people that are starving, the people that are at war, the people who we're just seeing the other sides of the world, we are feeling that too.
It's a good guess, not exactly. Anyone else?
If a child sees his mother, domestic violence, his father abusing his mother or her mother.
Well, that's a good guess too. That's actually that's direct trauma. I'm looking at all of you. Vicarious trauma is the trauma that we all take home with us by being helpers of people who have experienced trauma. So CASAs, child attorneys, social workers, teachers, if they care about these kids and they know what's happened to them, you take this home with you. I can tell you I've had years where I haven't slept well because of the kinds of cases I have. I'm not proud of that fact, but it's really important to take care of yourselves because of the kinds of trauma that you are helping. You're the conduit to help that child get to a better place to achieve permanency, but it's going to impact you directly, knowing what happened to the young person that you're representing. Any questions or thoughts on that? Okay, you're all sentient human feeling
I have a
beings,
question.
so you're going to take that. Yes.
When you say take care of yourself, what are you talking about? What kind of actions and activities are you talking about?
So I am not doing a self-care presentation today. We actually, Children and Families First does a lot of work around self-care, but what opportunities to make sure that you're taking a break to care for yourself, whether that's exercising, being with friends, binge watching that TV show to just mentally check out and relax your mind and recognize like you can do your part, but you don't control everything related to that child's life. And so worrying about every aspect of what's going on with that child can really take a toll on people. And if you look at like DFS caseworkers in particular, that is one of the most stressful jobs out there because they have 30 families that they're responsible to make sure those kids are safe. And so it can take a long toll. So self-care is just whatever you can do to take care of yourself, whether that's mindfulness, meditation, having a nice glass of wine, like it's whatever works for you.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. We have other trainings on self-care. That's just not the point of, or the main focus of this training. Any
Yeah, I
other
understand.
questions right now? Okay. So there, as I said, there's different kinds of trauma. There's also different kinds of stress. Positive stress is the kind that you've all experienced in your life, whether it's before you're giving a presentation before a group, taking a test in school, having to get up in front of a bunch of people, and if you were like reciting vows or giving a speech, those are all positive stressors. Your heart's pounding a little bit, you get sweaty palms, and then you do your thing, and it was a growth opportunity. You learned something from it, you got through it, and you feel better on the other side of it. Everyone has had those kinds of positive stressors where it's your time to shine and you have to take a big exam, kind of a thing. Then there's tolerable stress. That's the kind of stress that's stressful when it happens, but your body can come down and be okay after. So tolerable stressors are things like loss of a loved one, or, as we'll use Lauren's example, a car accident, where it's temporary, your body is kind of on high alert, same thing, your heart's pounding, you get a little bit shaky, you're very alert, and you're exhausted when whatever that stressor is kind of recedes, and then your body can go back to calm again. Toxic stress is the prolonged activation of the stress response. So the problem is, as I was talking about that complex trauma, a child who comes home to a house where there's no food, mom's using substances, dad's incarcerated, and Uncle Bucky is maybe coming home to sexually abuse him later. That child never has that moment to just calm himself down because he's on high alert at all times, trying to figure out if the world's a safe place. And what happens is your body needs cortisol and adrenaline to get through that stressful event. But in children and adults who've experienced toxic stress, they never have that chance for their body to go back to homeostasis where they can just recover and reset. So it's just their body's on that high alert, constantly pumping out cortisol and adrenaline. Questions on that? Okay. What does this do in the brain? So we've got two main parts. We got lots of parts of our brain, but in terms of trauma, there are two main parts of the brain. Here's my 5-minute neuroscience opportunity for you. So there's like your upstairs brain and your downstairs brain. And up here is your cerebral frontal cortex. That's where you make executive functioning decisions, higher order thinking, learning, all the kinds of things you need to do to be a successful human in this world. And then there's your downstairs brain. That's your limbic region back here. And that's where your amygdala is, your brainstem. A lot of those are your autonomic responses, like getting your heart to beat, breathing, making your body function, circulate. But your amygdala is in this back area, and that is what's often called your lizard brain. And that's where your fight, flight, or freeze response is. So that's what's telling you in the world, am I safe? Is everything okay? So it's that primitive portion of the brain. So it's where you go, where people go when they are really angry, really upset, or really stressed and don't feel safe. And what this looks like is when you're in the downstairs part of your brain, the amygdala is serving to do three things. So overall, your amygdala is always on, looking around, saying, am I safe? Am I safe? Is this okay? Is this okay? That's what the amygdala is doing at all moments in your life. But if you're at home and you feel pretty safe and you don't have to do a whole lot to worry about your safety, you can do all kinds of other things with your brain and your life. But if you're not feeling safe, there are three kinds of arousal responses. So there is fight, flight, or freeze. And two of them are hyperarousal, so fight and flight. So you want to punch someone out because you don't feel safe, or you're going to run because you don't feel safe. And then hypoarousal is, I am so scared right now, I'm frozen. And I think all of us have had, if you've had a stressful moment in your life, you may have had all three of those kinds of responses at different times, depending on what the stressor is. Questions about that? Okay. I'm going to show you a video. It's about 8 minutes long by Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris. And I think the easiest thing for me to do is stop sharing this and tee this up. All right, so as I tee this up, give me a second. Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris is currently the Surgeon General for the state of California, but she is a longtime pediatrician, and she's going to talk about the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. How many of you have heard about adverse childhood experiences?
Mhm.
Excellent. Has anyone seen Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris's video before? Well, Jessica, I know you have because they show it like every year at Children and Families First. Okay, so this video is going to give you a primer for the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, and then we're going to talk about what that actually looks like, how that manifests in children. And I'm only playing you about 9 minutes. It's a 15-minute video, but we don't have that kind of time today. So I suggest if you're really interested in this video that you watch the whole thing. There's a link in the PowerPoint I have. Oops, okay. Oops, hold on one second. I don't know why it's not. Okay, sorry about that. All right, let me share my screen again. What do you see?
A woman's talking.
We see your tetanus.
Ted on stage.
Okay, all right, let me just increase my volume a little bit before I hit play. Okay. Can you hear me? Can you hear it?
Barely.
No?
There's subtitles on mine.
All right. I'm gonna, give me 1 second. I'm gonna put it on YouTube because I think that's a little bit better. Sorry. Sometimes the volumes are a little tricky. Skip ahead. All right, give me 1 more minute. Let me just fix one more thing. Okay. Which screen do you see right now?
The YouTube screen.
Okay, great. Can you hear it?
We felt very proud of ourselves.
Yes.
Yes.
But then I started noticing a disturbing trend. A lot of kids were being referred to me for ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But when I actually did a thorough history and physical, what I found was that for most of my patients, I couldn't make a diagnosis of ADHD. Most of the kids I was seeing had experienced such severe trauma that it felt like something else was going on. Somehow, I was missing something important. Now, before I did my residency, I did a master's degree in public health. And one of the things that they teach you in public health school is that if you're a doctor and you see 100 kids that all drink from the same well, and 98 of them develop diarrhea, you can go ahead and write that prescription for dose after dose after dose of antibiotics, or you can walk over and say, what the hell is in this well? So I began reading everything that I could get my hands on about how exposure to adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. And then one day, my colleague walked into my office and he said, Dr. Burke, have you seen this? In his hand was a copy of a research study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. That day changed my clinical practice and ultimately my career. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study is something that everybody needs to know about. It was done by Dr. Vince Felitti at Kaiser and Dr. Bob Onda at the CDC, and together they asked 17,500 adults about their history of exposure to what they called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. Those include physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, parental mental illness, substance dependence, incarceration, parental separation or divorce, or domestic violence. For every yes, you would get a point on your ACE score. And then what they did was they correlated these ACE scores against health outcomes. What they found was striking. Two things. Number one, ACEs are incredibly common. 67% of the population had at least one ACE, and 12.6%, 1 in 8, had 4 or more ACEs. The second thing that they found was that there was a dose-response relationship between ACEs and health outcomes. The higher your ACE score, the worse your health outcomes. For a person with an ACE score of 4 or more, their relative risk of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease was 2.5 times that of someone with an ACE score of 0. For hepatitis, it was also 2.5 times. For depression, it was 4.5 times. For suicidality, it was 12 times. A person with an ACE score of 7 or more had triple the lifetime risk of lung cancer and 3.5 times the risk of ischemic heart disease, the #1 killer in the United States of America. Well, of course, this makes sense. You know, some people looked at this data and they said, come on, you know, you have a rough childhood, you're more likely to drink and smoke and do all these things that are going to ruin your health. This isn't science. This is just bad behavior. It turns out this is exactly where the science comes in. We now understand better than we ever have before how exposure to early adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. It affects areas like the nucleus accumbens, the pleasure and reward center of the brain that is implicated in substance dependence. It inhibits the prefrontal cortex, which is necessary for impulse control and executive function, a critical area for learning. And on MRI scans, we see measurable differences in the amygdala, the brain's fear response center. So there are real neurologic reasons why folks exposed to high doses of adversity are more likely to engage in high-risk behavior. And that's important to know. But it turns out that even if you don't engage in any high-risk behavior, you're still more likely to develop heart disease or cancer. The reason for this has to do with the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the brain's and body's stress response system that governs our fight or flight response. How does it work? Well, imagine you're walking in the forest and you see a bear. Immediately, your hypothalamus sends a signal to your pituitary, which sends a signal to your adrenal gland that says, release stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol. And so your heart starts to pound, your pupils dilate, your airways open up, and you are ready to either fight that bear or run from the bear. And that is wonderful if you're in a forest and there's a bear. But the problem is what happens when the bear comes home every night. And this system is activated over and over and over again. And it goes from being adaptive or life-saving to maladaptive or health-damaging. Children are especially sensitive to this repeated stress activation because their brains and bodies are just developing. High doses of adversity not only affect brain structure and function, they affect the developing immune system, developing hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed.
Okay, I'm going to put back the PowerPoint, but as I do, any reactions to that video?
Very interesting.
What do you think of the analogies?
I like the bear.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I think, we've all probably heard and thought about how these experiences affect children's behavior, but the link with the body and, long-term negative effects on health is not something that we might necessarily be aware of.
I was surprised by the number of adults that have been affected. And if you look at what's going on now, it just makes you wonder how many people, in our country have 4 or more ACEs in their background.
Carol, I'm so glad you mentioned that. I'm going to talk about some current events in a couple slides. So that's just my teaser for you that we're going to talk about that directly. Thank you. Any other reactions?
I was struck by the fact that folks who aren't displaying sort of unhealthy behaviors were sort of, their fate was cast on what happened in childhood, and how does that all play into modification, whether or not somebody is already on a trajectory for poor health outcomes based on their early life events, or whether that trajectory can be changed later on.
Great point. And the answer to that is yes, as idealistic as it would be for us to say, wish we could prevent all kinds of adverse childhood experiences, there are things we can do to reverse some of the damage that's caused. And that's where all of you come in as CASAs. You play a really powerful role in helping to reverse some of the early childhood adversity that kids experience. Okay. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on ACEs because this is, like I said, this was the aha moment for me. Years and years ago when this study came out, I started to understand from my perspective, because I do a lot of education advocacy for youth in foster care, for my clients, and at the time when I was a deputy child advocate, I had anywhere between 30 and 40 youth on my caseload at any given time. So now it's down to 3, which it's strange to only have 3. I have a lot of other things I'm juggling too. But all 3 of my current clients have special education needs. And when I became a deputy child advocate, I was going to suspension meeting after suspension meeting, a couple expulsion hearings, and it was shocking to me how few teachers fully understood what was going on with my clients, why they were actually having behavioral issues in school. And so before we get into that, I want to just talk about adverse childhood experiences, because just understanding what this looks like can really help you with your advocacy. Excuse me. So as Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris talked about, the original ACE study was done in the 1990s. And what's remarkable about that study was it was done with 17,500 adults. But those adults were primarily Caucasian, they were majority college educated, and they all had private health insurance. So that already sets them apart from a lot of the demographics that you and I work in as advocates for children. But what they found in that study of the people who were college educated, primarily Caucasian, and had private health insurance is that adverse childhood experiences were incredibly common. So 2/3 had at least one adverse childhood experience, and those with 4 or more had pretty remarkable impact to their health. What does it look like? So as I said, the number of ACEs are pretty significant. That 12% of our population in this one study had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. And what that means is those with 6+ adverse childhood experiences have a 20-year difference in their life expectancy. So let's just take a moment to think about that. 20 years. And there have been studies since. I've worked with a few researchers and doctors over the years who've been studying different populations. And your zip code can often be a determinant of your life expectancy. So I don't know if anyone is familiar with Philadelphia, but there are 2 lovely sounding areas. One is Society Hill, which I think many of you have probably been to. That's where like the Liberty Bell and all the old birth of our nation democracy areas. So it's beautiful, and there's all these lovely row homes where Ben Franklin lived. Society Hill, and then 3 miles away is Strawberry Mansion, which also sounds lovely, but it is very high poverty and very high crime rate. And there it was I believe, 20 to 30 year life expectancy difference just between those 2 neighborhoods within a 3-mile range. The same can be said for those of you who are familiar with different parts of Delaware. I recognize that you may live all over the state. Greenville is probably one of the most affluent areas in Delaware, and 3 miles away is the east side of Wilmington. Same thing. There is a 20+ year life expectancy differential between those 2 zip codes. And a lot of that has to do with adverse childhood experiences. So here are some of the general impacts that occur from adverse childhood experiences. The more adverse childhood experiences you have, the more adverse health outcomes you're likely to have. So you're more likely to, if you have a score of 4 or more ACEs, you're more likely to smoke. You're 7 times more likely to be an alcoholic. You're 2 times more likely to have cancer or heart disease, 12 times more likely to have attempted suicide, 32 times more likely to have behavior problems in school. Those are just some of the statistics. That's just from the ACE score alone, that there's this strong correlation between those 2 things. Questions on that?
Yeah.
It's pretty sobering information. So in the early 2010s, a group in Philadelphia said, you know what, the adverse childhood experiences study was revolutionary. It helped us understand the correlation between early adversity and later health outcomes. But what about populations that don't fit that original mold? As I told you, the original adverse childhood experiences study was concentrated with Caucasian, educated, private health insurance. What does it look like when the demographics are more diverse and the population is more likely to have Medicaid as their health insurance? And Medicaid coverage comes from, often you have to be below a certain poverty level to receive Medicaid. So they added Philadelphia did an urban ACE study with about 2,500 people, and they added 4 more categories of adverse childhood experiences. So they added community violence, discrimination, bullying, and foster care. And they found the same kinds of correlation with adversity and later health outcomes occurred. And what this study did was it helped open our eyes that this list is not exhaustive, the adverse childhood experiences list. So I can just name a few other ones right now: experiencing homelessness, food insecurity. How about parents who are undocumented and you're not sure if they're coming home, if they'll be there when you get home from school every night? Those are just 3 additional adverse childhood experiences that can occur. And I bet you can all think of 1 or 2 other types of early adversity that kids could experience that adds to this toxic stress buildup in their bodies. There's another study by Dr. Wendy Ellis, who I've been able to be on some meetings and do some work with. And I love this diagram that she has, because as we are talking a little bit about the racial reckoning that our country is going through right now, there has been systemic oppression for hundreds of years in this country. And a lot of the reason that children experience adverse childhood experiences comes from adverse community experiences. So kids don't live in a bubble. They're part of a family where a family has experienced adversity. But a lot of these families have also experienced community adversity because they lack opportunities. This is often when I'm a law professor, when I get on a tangent, I often talk about redlining. Do any of you know what redlining is?
Yeah. That was,
Anyone want to volunteer and say what it is for the group?
it was the government policy where whites were allowed to live in certain areas and Black people were confined usually to a city or a city area neighborhoods.
Yes.
I think it had a lot to do with real estate sales.
Yes, that's correct. So it's a little more precise than that. It's where people could apply for certain mortgages and purchase homes in certain areas. So these redlining plans circled off areas where Black people, people of color could not purchase property. And so that meant that they couldn't go to the same kinds of schools. So that it effectively created segregation and a lack of opportunities. And if you add to that, if you look at our interstate highway system in the United States, a lot of highways cut through impoverished neighborhoods. So if you even think about in Delaware, 95 cuts through the east side and west side of the center of Wilmington, which is not an affluent area. And that has also created additional lack of opportunity. So there is this systemic oppression that's kind of the underpinnings for a lot of adversity that children have. And I talk about this a lot in long-term presentations I do and my law courses, because I want my students and I want people in my audiences to understand that children aren't in a bubble, that their adversity isn't usually just from an experience they've had. It's from an experience their families had and their community has had. And it's really important to understand the structural dynamics of why we have some of these kinds of adversities. Because if you live in a place where you don't have upward mobility, where you have hopelessness, where you don't have job opportunities or healthy, safe housing, then it's going to create this systemic issue of substance abuse, mental illness, incarceration, and neglect. Questions or comments on that?
Yes, I have a comment. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I had a comment, and I was just, as you were talking about all of this, I was just thinking about all the children that have been coming over on the border and what their experiences and what all that effect is having on them.
It's a great point. And I can tell you, almost the majority of those children are fleeing situations where it's unsafe for them, or there's just such abject poverty that they have no hope for opportunities. And so they would risk their lives to come over to the United States. I've had a couple clients who were immigrants. I actually have one now who is now receiving special immigrant juvenile status in the US. But one of my clients who came over, she fled a dangerous situation in Guatemala, was raped at the border, and she was 14, came to the US. She had a cousin in Delaware, so she made her way to Delaware, and then was removed from her cousin because she was pregnant, and DFS was concerned about her receiving certain kinds of services, placed in a non-Spanish speaking foster home. And Spanish was actually her second language. She spoke a native dialect in Guatemala. So there were layer upon layer of traumatic issues that my 14-year-old client faced before we were able to get her immigration status and back to her cousin. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really great point.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention one other variable that Britain has noticed, not only poor housing, not only poor education, lack of opportunity, economic mobility, but the fact that many people are surrounded by enormous wealth is another variable, recognized in Britain, of course.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments right now? All right, well, Carol, this one's for you since you helped set me up nicely. Thank you. So over the last year, we've had collective trauma. There's no denying right now that this pandemic is traumatic for all of us. But if you think about what kids are going through in this, the fact that I have two children, one is rarely going to school. And so she's effectively missed an entire year of school. And so you're missing out on that socialization. You're missing out on your education. There are so many losses from this year that kids are experiencing that I think this in and of itself, the pandemic is another adverse childhood experience because it's stressful for all of us. But for kids, it's that much more stressful because kids thrive on routines. They thrive on that structure of going to school. And the majority of kids in the United States right now aren't even receiving that level of support. And when you add for kids who live in poverty, that sometimes school is the one safe place for them where they're getting at least 2 meals a day. For those kids who are remote, they're not even getting that additional nurturing and support that they need. But I would be remiss to say that right now, as our country is grappling with the murder of George Floyd and many, many others, and the new case of the new young person who was just killed by a police officer, that we have systemic oppression in this country, and that I think we need to recognize that a lot of our children of color walk around in this country wondering, are they less than? Are they safe because the people that are supposed to be protecting us and providing services for us aren't keeping our communities safe, and particularly for those of color, Black and brown children and adults. Any questions or comments on this?
I have a question or a comment. I think families that stay together have a better chance. And there's so many families that it's just the moms raising the kids, and it's very hard. And they need to have guidance and support with their family.
Yep. So 2 comments to that. Thank you, Mindy. First, some of that has to do with historical racism and historical oppression. So in this country, because of African Americans were an enslaved people, they couldn't get married and their families were separated and sold off. And so there's this historical racism and historical oppression because families historically had been separated, particularly African American families. But even now, the way that what I showed you on that last slide with structural oppression, that it kind of creates this dynamic where a lot of times families aren't able to stay together in that same way because there are just so many other layers of trauma that they're dealing with. If you think about, I'm assuming most of you have a current case right now. And what I saw time and time again in the 15 years that I've been doing child welfare is families that have a support system don't end up in the child welfare system. I want you to think about that because all of us have had trying moments. Any of us who've been parents have had trying moments, but you have a support system where you can tap out and say, I need you to just take over for 10 minutes because I just need to calm down. Or I have to go to work, and so could you please help me care for my child? The families that are in the child welfare system do not have that support structure in place, and it's horrible, it's heartbreaking, it's traumatic, and that's why those kids are separated. That's why a lot of times kids are placed in foster care because there isn't a family member or someone else who can say, yep, I can take your child for a little bit while you get back on your feet. So there's great inequity in our country and in our system.
And a lot of times in the past, you had extended family members that would be available to pick up the slack or the need. And now everybody's just so dispersed and they're no longer together. They're in different states. And so you don't have that structure, like you said, and that support.
That's right. Yep. So families are spread out. And if you think going back to the current situation of the pandemic, you might have people who were previously working who were laid off or can't work because they got sick. And so now when someone needs something, they don't have room or financial ability to help cover the cost. Kids are expensive. And as much as you might love a child, if you're barely able to feed yourself and your own family, adding on to that can be that much more debilitating or difficult for many families. Any other questions or comments on this?
Well, I think we no longer can deny racism, discrimination. it's just, you know, I think it was sort of kept a lid on, and now the nation really has to determine what kind of country we're going to be. And are we really inclusive? Do we really, you know, care about each other? Are we really going to change systems, criminal justice system, police systems, to make this a better nation? Or are we just going to go on the way we are? I mean, it's not any different to me, actually, than it was in the 60s. Same issues, but not maybe to the degree that it is now. But I think it's a positive thing that we're going to have to deal with as a country.
Thank you. And just when you think about adverse childhood experiences and the long-term health consequences of those, and I told you that discrimination has been seen to be an adverse childhood experience for children, imagine how people of color who feel this intense discrimination, who felt this structural oppression, this has health consequences, which in turn have financial consequences for our whole country because of lost productivity, cost for healthcare treatment. So this not only impacts us in terms of how we care about each other and how we treat people with respect and dignity, but it also impacts our financial well-being as a country. So there's lots of elements here that we should be thinking about. And this impacts the kids that you're representing, no matter what their race, demographic, or background, because of the health consequences and educational consequences. So I'm going to get into the educational consequences. Right now in our country, this is a slide that from a report that came out in 2018 that showed the number of children with 2 or more adverse childhood experiences. Remember, what I told you is the more adversity that child experiences, the worse off their health and education outcomes. And so we are considered, I don't know if you can see my little arrow here. Hold on, there we go. The South Atlantic, I don't know why we're considered the South Atlantic in Delaware, but in this study we are. And if you look at it, 30% of Black children have experienced 2 or more adverse childhood experiences. Hispanic and other, like multiracial, about a quarter have experienced 2 or more. And then white children, 20% have experienced adverse childhood experiences. So this is very real, that we're already seeing this. And if you want to even drill down further, I have studies that show even in Delaware, half of all children have experienced at least one adverse childhood experience by the time they turn 18. So when I go and I do presentations for teachers, I say, cut your classroom in half. Half of your kids have already experienced at least one adverse childhood experience. So what does this look like for the brain? So I don't know if anyone is familiar with Dr. Bruce Perry. He's a famous neuropsychiatrist, and he was, sorry, there's a plane going overhead. He treated many of the children that came out of the Branch Davidian compound when the feds went in and they removed a bunch of children. And he's been studying trauma for years and years. And so he's done a lot of work on what toxic stress and trauma do to brain development. Does anyone see a difference in these 2 brains? It's pretty obvious, right? One's a lot bigger than the other. So the brain on what I think is your left is a normal brain, and what I think might be your right is a child that has suffered extreme neglect. So this is the brain of these are 2 separate 3-year-olds, same age. One grew up in a nurtured environment, and the other one, I believe, was from a Romanian orphanage who suffered extreme neglect. And so a lot of times kids who come from other countries who get adopted in the US, if they were in an orphanage, they aren't nurtured, they're not held, they're usually just sitting in a crib until someone can come and change a diaper or feed them. There are dramatic differences in brain development. But all hope is not lost. I'm going to show you another slide about brains in a second too. But what I often like to think about these brains is the one on the extremely neglected brain looks kind of shriveled up. Anybody have houseplants? Why am I bringing houseplants up? Okay. Those of you who have houseplants, what happens if you don't water your plant for a few weeks?
It shrivels up.
It shrivels up. It doesn't die, right? It just shrivels up, right? And what happens then when you say, oh, I've been ignoring my houseplant, let me start watering it again? What happens to it?
Goes back to normal.
It comes back, right?
Yeah.
I want
Maybe
you to
not
use
to
that,
normal, but
use that analogy when you think about kids. Any child who's experienced adversity and has neglect or changes to their brains are plastic. That means they might prune certain neurons, but they can grow and develop new neural connections. So even if you see a child who's had significant adversity, that doesn't mean their brain's going to be shriveled and damaged for the rest of their lives. It means we as a society, we as child representatives need to help build and strengthen new neural connections and new neural pathways. The more positive experience a child has, the more their brain grows and rebuilds. So I really want you to take that point home, that all this depressing stuff I'm talking about doesn't have to be this way, that we have a responsibility and an opportunity to help our kids. But here's what it kind of looks like for kids in school. So this is another version. This is an MRI scan of a healthy brain and an abused child's brain. And as I was telling you, so this is the front of the brain. Oh wait, you're not seeing my little, well, let me get my little pointer. Hopefully you can see my arrow. The healthy brain, the red, that's where most of the activity is going on in the brain. That's in your prefrontal cortex. That's where executive functioning and learning happens. And in a child with an abused brain, it's back here near the amygdala. So this is where the brain's circuitry and the neurons are most active. What this is telling me is a child with a healthy brain is going to spend most of their time in their upstairs brain where they have executive functioning skills, impulse control, and they can learn. The child with an abused brain is spending most of their time wondering, am I safe? Is everything okay? I'm in the amygdala right now. What's going on? I'm just going to keep assessing for safety. I want you to think about this as I talk to you about what happens to kids in school who have significant adverse experiences. So kids who've experienced 4 or more ACEs are 32 times more likely to have learning or behavior problems. That means they're likely to be placed in special education. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. People ask me that, well, is that a bad thing if they're placed in special ed? Not necessarily. Sometimes special ed can be really wonderful because it gives kids additional supports. But what that tells me is that kids who've had serious adversity need accommodations to be able to participate in school. I've had, some kids on my caseload who are absolutely brilliant. I mean, they can take a test, they can take one of the standardized tests and knock it out without even studying and do amazingly well, but they don't function well in school because they're constantly worrying about their safety. They're 7 times more likely to end up in prison. I mean, these are not good statistics. They're more likely to have decreased IQ scores, lower grade point averages. Oh, sorry for the typo, school absences. I will fix that. No, maybe I did spell it correctly. Anyway, decreased rates of high school graduation and increased rates of expulsions and suspension. And that's true for our youth in foster care. So when we look at some of the standardized testing proficiency for math and English, there's often a 30% disparity between kids who are not in foster care and kids who are in foster care for English, like reading and math scores. And I will tell you, in Delaware, our proficiency rates are not that great. They're around 50% for a public school. So what we're saying is that most of our youth in foster care are below 20% then for their proficiency for reading and math scores. And we know studies show that if you are not proficient in reading by 3rd grade, your chance of graduating is that much more reduced because it's really difficult to catch up once the gap begins to widen. Anyone know why I have a picture of an air traffic control station here?
Isn't that one of the most stressful jobs and they have the highest rate of suicide?
I think you're right about it being one of the most stressful jobs. I don't know about the suicide rate, but yes. Air traffic controllers have a very stressful job. Air traffic controllers are kind of like what the brain is doing. The brain's getting information coming in and the information trying to go out. And so I want you to think through, if any of you have either been in a kindergarten classroom recently or can hearken back to the days when you were in kindergarten, if you think about what happens when you walk into a kindergarten classroom pre-COVID, there are rules on the wall that say Sit still, be quiet, keep your hands to yourself. Only talk after the teacher calls on you. Don't let anyone else bother you. Those are 5 things you're asking a kindergartner to do right now. If I have a kindergartner who's experienced adversity coming into that classroom, sitting down and trying to assess, am I safe? Am I safe? Is everything okay? And then I have these 5 extra rules that I need to focus on. We're not really setting that kid up for a whole lot of success. Another example that I often use is if you have a child who has been in a chaotic home where the TV is always blaring and the caregivers are always yelling at each other, and they go into school and they're shouting and they're being loud, and the teacher says, shh, let's use our inside voices. What's that child's experience with an inside voice?
None.
Everyone's been yelling, right? So for a lot of kids, they don't understand. For kids who have had chaotic home lives, they don't know what an inside voice is. They don't know that you have to follow these 5 rules and constantly assess for safety. So a lot of times with our air traffic control system, where our brain is trying to assess all these rules at the same time as taking information in and then figuring out when it's okay to talk and use this information, that is a lot of chaos that our air traffic control system, our brain, has to do. And for kids who are assessing for safety, that's all the more difficult. So that would be like the air traffic controller who's dealing with 3 crashes in the background, still trying to help other planes take off and land at the same time. It's nearly impossible. And so how that manifests in the classroom is we have kids who are really impulsive, who need to go to the nurse because their head hurts or their stomach hurts, they need some nurturing. They have difficulty regulating themselves. Questions about this? Okay.
Well, it's just multitasking. It's just too much for a lot of kids. Things have to be presented clearly, simply, one step at a time, breaking big tasks down into little ones.
I love that you mentioned that, because there are a lot of teachers out there who have high expectations for kids, and it's wonderful that they have high expectations for kids, but if teachers don't understand how trauma and toxic stress impact kids, this is where your advocacy comes in. You can go to a school and say, I've got this amazing young person that I represent, and I know they can do it, but I need your help to break these things down for them so that they can see success, so they can be successful. Because if you give them 4 paragraphs of something to read and you tell them they have to go and do this assignment and do it in 10 minutes while they're still trying to assess for safety, you're setting them up for failure. So if you can set kids up for success, every time you are able to help advocate for them or give them something else they can feel good about because they accomplished, it's going to help build those neural pathways and help them long term. So this is where your advocacy can be really powerful. All right, I want you to think through how many of any of you who have current children that you represent, how many of them are either diagnosed with ADHD or you think they might be taking ADHD medicine? Okay, just a couple. Interesting. A lot of times I get more hands than that. And I'm showing you this slide because there's a significant overlap between trauma and ADHD. And the main difference that we know for whether something is trauma or ADHD is the medication working. I can't tell you how many kids I've represented who are diagnosed with ADHD, but really it's trauma because they manifest in many of the same ways. They both have symptoms of impulsivity, irritability, feelings of not belonging or being extremely alert, talking excessively, not being able to deal with social emotional well-being. So if you look at the overlap, they're easily distracted, they're hyperactive, they're restless, difficulty sleeping. I bet almost all your clients have experienced some of those things. And I can't tell you how many times I go into school and I hear, they probably need some ADHD medication. Well, no, actually, those are symptoms and manifestations of trauma because the body, there's an amazing book by Bessel van der Kolk called The Body Keeps the Score. It's a wonderful book. He's a psychiatrist who's done a lot of work with children with trauma. And he studied that trauma is actually stored at a cellular level. And so kids need to sometimes get out that energy to be able to function, because the trauma makes them so restless and hyperactive. And oftentimes, because trauma is stored at a cellular level, a sight, a smell, a sound, anything can trigger that traumatic response. So then that's when your amygdala is going off saying, I'm not safe. Do I need to flee? Do I need to fight someone? Do I freeze? And having those systems constantly triggering makes it really difficult to do well in school. All right. Oftentimes, yeah, go ahead.
I have a question. Do you find that when children are undergoing trauma like this, especially, let's say, in a classroom setting, that they are sometimes diagnosed to the extent that they are put on medication before a lot of these other things are dealt with? I mean, it's easy to put a child on medication and say they need to calm down. But the reasons for their activity, for this hypertension or hyperactivity, is not being addressed.
Absolutely right. So sometimes medication is a wonderful option to try to help kids. I'm not anti-medication. I don't want you to think that. I think that medication serves a really important role. But there are times where kids who've experienced trauma don't have everything they need. And I can tell you this because I every year go and teach pre-service teachers at University of Delaware, and I've gone into lots of schools to talk about this. And I asked them, when you were training to be a teacher, how many of you learned about trauma? If you know that half of your kids in your classroom have experienced at least one adverse childhood experience, how many of you have learned anything about this? And most of them say nothing. That's not what they teach you when you go to become a teacher. And so we're asking teachers to do some of this social work type of, and social emotional learning for kids, when really they went to school to become teachers so that they can teach kids in an education setting. Right. And so what I often say is, for kids who've experienced trauma, if you have a child who's fidgety, maybe it's ADHD, maybe it's not. Either way, what I can tell you is giving that child like do I have one on my desk? I don't think I have one right now. I have lots of little kinetic types of movement bands and things like that to show as examples, but like stretchy bands or desks that swivel or bouncy ball chairs. I'm sure some of you have seen those kinds of balls that kids can sit on. If you have an opportunity to advocate for your child to have something like that so they can move while they're learning, kids actually can retain more information, especially kids who have ADHD or trauma, if they can move and release some of that stress tension out. So this is actually a win-win for kids, because you're getting them to stay in place while they're moving, they're not interrupting anybody, and then they can focus a little bit more. So those are all great things to try to advocate for.
I had a question about how proactive, in your experience, have the schools been for children who are under guardianship or have been adopted, in terms of identifying these risk factors and then actually proactively doing something, rather than waiting and observing behavior problems and/or achievement problems. Are schools active in really flagging these students and dealing with them in a appropriate way or not? What's your experience?
That is an excellent question, and I would say it's hit or miss. I think it has to do sometimes with the individual teacher or the administration and how much education they have on these kinds of issues, whether they've had students who've gone through who've had this kind of trauma. I actually had a teacher who was so moved by this presentation, she started I don't know if it was like a GoFundMe campaign. Teachers have some kinds of fundraiser types of things, and she purchased materials to create a kinetic classroom. So every single student in her class of 30 kids, each were able to take one kinetic movement thing each day, and they had to put it back at the end of the day, and they had to rotate. So some kids got the bouncy ball, other kids got the tension bands, some kids got like, oh, here's one of my toys that I have, these little, I don't even know what you call them. The goo goes down like a wind chime, so not wind chime, I don't know. Anyone know what these are called?
I don't,
You know
but
what
I
I'm talking
definitely remember having them as a kid.
Yeah. So this one teacher loved the idea, and I asked her. She was doing some. We were doing some work when I was at the Office of the Child Advocate. We had a grant to do some training for schools, so I'd check in with her periodically, and she found that overall her kids were more engaged. She had fewer disciplinary offenses because the kids had a way to get out some of their movement. So I love your question, John. Unfortunately, I think it's very teacher or school specific, but the Department of Ed has been doing a lot of work to try to provide support and training for teachers and all educators to learn more about how to support kids with trauma or ADHD, because none of these things are bad. So if it's ADHD or trauma, the same kinds of responses can be helpful for either. So we're not medicating our way through all of these problems. We're trying to come up with systemic ways to try to help.
I'm involved in Newcastle County Head Start, and we have had in-service on trauma, and I'm a early childhood advocate, and I think we need to really hit, well, now the new pre-Ks that are going to be in the public schools, those teachers and daycare workers. I think we really have to start even before a child enters school, because so much of what happens from birth to 4 or 5 influences the learning experience, and I'm hopeful that that's happening.
It is in pockets.
Yes, it's hit or miss. You're right. It is hit or miss.
Yeah. I love this picture. I stole this from another training that I saw. That how do we see kids with challenging behavior? And I want you to think about this in terms of when you go into a court hearing, how much of the time that we're talking about kids, is it negative stuff or positive stuff? And Lauren and I have gone on soapboxes and done presentations to talk about this, that we really need to spend more time talking about the strengths of a child and the strengths of a family rather than the shark fin, because underneath is this lovely, sweet goldfish of a child who is terrified in this world and just assessing for safety. And we need to start changing the narrative and the dynamic of how we're looking at kids. There are no bad kids out there. They're kids who've had really, really bad experiences, and maybe they make some bad choices as a result. There are no bad kids. They're learning as they go. So this is, if you remember nothing else from this presentation, if you want to become trauma informed, it's this simple. All you have to do is change your lens. Stop asking what's wrong with you. And I mean that not only for your clients, but also for their families. What's wrong with that family? Stop asking that question. What happened to this child, or what happened to this family? If you just change the narrative from what's wrong with them to what happened to them, if you had experienced what some of these kids had, it's amazing that they can even go to school and do well in certain circumstances, because it's difficult. So I've had some clients who've had 8 to 10 ACEs where their mom had depression, their mom was using substances, dad was incarcerated, they were sexually abused, they were physically abused, their mom was separated, and their mom experienced domestic violence. I mean, I could keep going on, but you can see how sometimes ACEs start to pile up. And so if we just start to think about what happened to you, and then look at it from a strengths-based perspective of what's right with you, what can I do to help you? So I challenge you, and I'm sure Lauren has done this in all of your trainings, but in every court hearing you go to, I want you to make sure you ask the DFS caseworker or the foster parent, tell me 3 amazing things about Timmy or whatever your child's name is. And if they can't think of 3, shame on them, and they need to start working on finding those 3 things. So make sure when you talk to the child attorney, say, hey, can you ask this question? Or if they don't and you have the opportunity to testify, that's your chance to let the judge know, here's what I see that's so amazing with this kid, because all the kids that you're working with have something amazing about them. And if you can do something to compliment their parent, that's also oftentimes, if the permanency plan is reunification, that can be a huge motivator for parents, because just imagine how those parents feel when they go into court. And I can't tell you, there's one particular judge, if parents are using substances, he will start to ask them what their drug of choice is. And it makes me cringe, because Why would any parent want to go back to that court hearing and subject themselves to that, to feeling that shame because they have a substance abuse issue? So if we can do things to be positive in these court hearings, there is a time to be adversarial, but it doesn't have to be all the time. Questions, comments about that? Okay. If you go into school meetings, and many of you will have kids with IEPs, I want you to make sure you're listening for that, whether there's negative language, whether you can turn that around to something that's strengths-based or trauma-informed. So this student's choosing to act out. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that. What you've just learned about the brain is a lot of times kids aren't choosing to act out. That's their amygdala going off, screaming, fire, fire, something's not right here, I don't feel safe. So if you can say, you know what, this is a child who doesn't feel very safe or is having some behavioral issues because they don't have the skills right now. So instead of saying they're choosing to act out, what can you do to help them choose to make good choices? What can the school do to help set them up for success? And I'm not going to go through all of these, but I think it's really helpful to just look at some of these. All right, I'm going to start off with, before we go into things that you can do, a story about one of my clients, who I call Quinn. He was in 2nd grade and he was about 40 pounds. He was adorable, he had great dimples. And Quinn went to school one day and he was doing his math homework, but he was fidgeting. As I told you, for kids who've experienced a lot of trauma, they can be very fidgety because it's just the body's way of releasing some of this stress and anxiety. And so while he was working, I don't know if you can hear me, but he was tapping his pencil like this, and it was annoying all the kids around him. And so Quinn's teacher came over and said, Quinn, you have to stop tapping. Quinn kept tapping. And some of the kids were complaining. And so the teacher put his hand on Quinn's shoulder and said, Quinn, stop tapping. Quinn reflexively punched the teacher, ran out of the classroom, ran into another classroom, tore it up. And I got a call later saying, Miss Eliza, we suspended Quinn. He attacked a teacher and he destroyed property, and we're moving towards expulsion proceedings. So being a lawyer, I put on my pinstripe suit, of course, because that's what you do when you want to scare people. So I went down to the school and I said, tell me exactly what's going on. They said, well, Quinn assaulted a teacher. I'm like, my little 45-pound client in 2nd grade, he was tiny. He assaulted a teacher, and so he's so vicious, you need to expel him. Let me understand this a little bit more. What the school didn't know was that Quinn had actually been sexually and physically abused by many adult caregivers he'd had before he'd entered foster care. And so I tried to explain I didn't say this part because schools don't have a right to know all the reasons why kids come into care. They just need to know that a child has experienced trauma. That's all they need to know. What I explained to them was Quinn had experienced significant trauma. And so when the teacher touched his shoulder, he didn't feel safe. And that was a reflexive reaction. That wasn't Quinn trying to be smart or acting out because he wanted to be defiant of the teacher. So we were able to get him a behavior intervention plan, and I didn't have to sue the school, which made them happy. But the reason I tell you that story is a lot of teachers and a lot of staff aren't going to know the trauma histories of their students. And many of them, as I told you, don't necessarily know the kinds of trainings and things that help. But all Quinn's teacher had to do was try to figure out another way, instead of touching his shoulder, saying, hey, Quinn, eyes on me, or Quinn, I'm about to touch your shoulder because I want to redirect you. If you do those kinds of things, you might stop these other disciplinary infractions. So the most important thing we can do to be trauma informed is to just have this awareness that all of our clients who are in foster care have experienced some kind of trauma. They experienced whatever that trauma was that led to the hotline report, and then they were removed from their family. So they've had at least 2 traumatic things happen to them in their young lives. Ask before you touch. So I have had many clients where they do an amazing job. I'm so proud of them, but I will always say, can I give you a hug? Can I give you a high five or a fist bump or whatever? And some of them will say, they'll roll their eyes and say, yes, Miss Eliza, okay, you can high five me. But I always ask their permission first, because if you have a child that you know is constantly assessing for safety, all of a sudden the adult in their life is saying, I'm asking your permission. You have the opportunity to tell me you're in control. And 9 times out of 10, they'll say yes. But giving them that chance for their brain to calm down and say, this is a safe person, I'm okay right now. Yes, a high five is all right. Triggers. Don't take it personally if you trigger a child. I've had plenty of clients. I'll give you 2 quick examples. One where I went to go and talk to her, and we had to talk about termination of parental rights. And I did it even with the therapist present because I knew it was going to be a tough conversation. I got a call an hour later that the child was so distraught they actually had to admit her into, I think, Rockford. That's one of the psychiatric hospitals. I felt terrible. Like it was my fault, but I had to have this conversation with her, and I tried to do it in the most supportive way possible. And then I think a few years ago, I had a teacher, I was giving a presentation like this, and a teacher came up to me and said, you know, one day I had a client, or one of my students come in, and he was having a tough day, and it was Friday. I was trying to cheer him up. And does anyone know what pre-COVID times they normally serve in the cafeteria on Fridays for lunch?
Pizza.
Pizza, right. So the teacher was saying, it's okay, Timmy, today's pizza day. And that actually set Timmy off. And the reason it set Timmy, the student, off was because a week before, his parents had a horrific domestic violence incident. And right before the domestic violence incident, Timmy's mom took him to they picked up pizza on the drive home, and the pizza was hot, fresh out of the oven, while mom and dad were in the throes of a domestic violence incident. And as I told you, trauma stored at a cellular level. So a sight, a smell, a sound, certain events can be triggered from anything. And so when Timmy saw the Friday pizza day, that made his brain trigger back to that horrific experience. So whenever he thought of pizza, he attached it with a really awful adverse memory, not something like, pizza. And so I tried to explain this to the teacher a little bit, that the way that trauma is stored in the body, you did nothing wrong by trying to cheer Timmy up by talking about the Friday pizza day. Don't take it personally. But the more you know, the better you can be. And next time you can say, oh, Timmy, I'm so sorry that was a tough thing for you. And you file that away as, okay, let's not do pizza day anymore. Let's not talk about that. Another thing that you can do to be trauma informed is be consistent with your clients. And I'll give you the example of, I had a client named Jay who was very traumatized, and it took me a long time to develop a relationship with him because he was so guarded. And finally, over time, he was willing to talk to me, and he was doing well in school. So I said, you know what, Jay, you're doing so well in school. How about next time I come see you, I'm going to take you to get McDonald's, because that was a really exciting thing for him. Well, it turned out that the next time I went to see him, I said, I'm going to come Tuesday after school. Tuesday after school turned out to be a blizzard, and the roads were shut down. So there was no way that I was going to be able to see Jay. And Jay was really distraught. And he felt like he couldn't trust me, because even though there was a natural reason for me not to be able to go and see him, there was a blizzard and it wouldn't have been safe for either of us. I don't even think McDonald's was operational that day. I still let him down. And so what I always tell people that I'm training on trauma is be consistent. So if you're going to make a promise, follow through. It's okay to make promises, but here's what I do now. So my clients like Jay is, I say, you know what, I'm going to come see you in 2 weeks. I got a lot of bandwidth then to figure out there can't be a blizzard every single day of that 2 weeks, or I'm not going to have a personal family member who's sick for 2 weeks that I can't figure something out, right? So be consistent, make promises if you feel you can, but keep them. And the more you see your clients, the more consistent you'll be. All right. The last piece I will say is, we'll talk about resilience. That resilience, I think sometimes, I don't love the term, because I think sometimes it's asking a child or asking a person to do something rather than us trying to figure out what we can do to support and wrap around children. But the science behind this idea of being able to bounce back or recover, or sometimes people call it post-traumatic growth. So if you've heard of post-traumatic stress, this is what happens after the stress, that people grow and change. And the way that kids in particular bounce back from adversity and recover and heal and move forward is by having at least one trusted adult. And you as CASAs can be that one trusted adult, because they can't control a lot of things in their environment. They can't control when they get to see mom and dad. Right now in the pandemic, they can't even control if and when they get to go to school. But one thing that they can control, and one thing you can control, is that relationship where you are a consistent person in their life, checking in on them, making them feel special, making them feel like they have a voice in this whole chaotic process. And so you can be part of their resilience. And the more resilient, the more kids bounce back and grow. If you think back to my picture of the kid with, or the picture of the shriveled brain and the healthy brain, just like plants, if you water and nurture these kids, their brains are going to regrow and they're going to become successful, wonderful, amazing human beings if given the chance. And sometimes, you know, some kids have had, unfortunately, so many traumatic things that it makes it really difficult for that to happen. But remember that kids make mistakes. They're supposed to do dumb stuff. We just don't want the dumb stuff and the mistakes to be really, really bad. All right, questions or comments?
Eliza, can I go back to what you said about saying positive things about kids, especially in court? So everybody, all CASAs, when you fill out your court report, the very first box under child is listing their strengths, and the second one is listing their interests. So I want you to think about, when you are completing your court report, that you should absolutely have those three things, both for their interests and their strengths. But like Eliza said, when she said, ask the attorney to ask the DFS worker or foster parent to say 3 positive things about that child, if there's silence, we should be able to step up immediately and say those 3 things. But with that said, when you're filling out your court report, I want you to kind of be the glass half full person if we are working on reunification. So remember, reunification services, we are working to support a family by providing services in hopes that the parents might be able to make some changes to make it safe for the child to come back home. So I'll use visitation, for example. So in the very first part of, we'll take mom's case plan, since she's listed first on the court report. If under visitation, she's attended 50% of the visits, instead of saying something like she has missed half of the visits, we can use that same information, but flip it around in a more positive light, so that while she's missed half, she's also attended half. Now let's maybe explore why she's missed the other half of those visits. Maybe she's missed those visits because she was working. Maybe she missed the visits with her child because she was going to her own mental health counseling. Maybe she was going to her own substance abuse counseling. So when you're filling out your court report, try to be the glass half full. And a lot of you do this already, so I want to commend you and thank you for that. But instead of saying, mom has missed half her visits, let's explore that a little further and then try to get to why. Another thing, I just had a CASA recently discover that the parent in their case plan, in their case, was missing half the visits because the schedule didn't work for that parent. So as CASA, think about, why are these things happening? Why are each element not being completed? And maybe there's barriers that we can very easily fix, or at least consider adjusting a little bit in order to make those case plans and those elements more achievable. So rather than looking at this parent doesn't want to visit or is choosing not to visit, that may not always be the case. So think about kind of glass half full. What are some of the positive things that the parents are also doing as part of their reunification case plan?
I agree with what you just said, Lauren, because even in my report, the parent missed the meeting. But what happened was where she lives, she can't get a good connection. And so everything is like, not that she didn't want to go, but now I understand through talking to my coordinator as to why she missed it. Now we maybe can go and find out whether DFS or somebody can provide her services so that she would be able to have a better connection on her phone or a computer or whatever. So that what you just mentioned helped me, or is helpful, because now I know that had I put down Had I not put down what the reason was or looked at the reason, then I wouldn't know that there could be some services we could offer her, so that it's not every time I make a report on her visitation, she says, well, I couldn't make a connection. Well, can't we do something about that? Wouldn't we do something to help her?
Joyce, and you're right, because the purpose of our presence here, especially in reunification, is to help the family. We're not very helpful if we say, oh, she'd missed the meeting. Well, yes, but let's dig up why. And then, so Joyce, you did the perfect thing by trying to figure out, why did she miss the meeting? So pre-pandemic, our biggest challenge was transportation. You know, now maybe our biggest challenge is connection and stable internet. So, you know, we still have challenges, but now we can look to see if there's any, like you said, Joyce, maybe Division of Family Services has some resources that we can get her a hotspot or I know Comcast for a while was offering, you know, some internet services. So maybe maybe now that service, instead of a transportation service, now we need a connection service.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I had a general question, and it's sort of turning the attention back to trauma and education. And again, I'm maybe a one-tune person on this, but for example, if you had a 3 to 4 year old child who was adopted or under guardianship, et cetera, it doesn't matter, but how early and how aggressive should you be with a school system to sort of work with them as a CASA or anybody who's involved directly with the care of these kids to ensure that early screening goes on and not wait for failure to occur or problems to sort of surface before sort of mobilizing, whether it's developing an IEP early on in first grade or whatever the case may be. But it just has been my experience that the schools are waiting for someone to come to them to, you know, to sort of advocate on behalf of our clients, rather than the school being notified, here is a child at risk. What are your plans for dealing with it as early as possible? And so I'd just be curious about that.
Excellent point. So I will start by saying it really depends who holds educational rights to the child. So if the parents are still, if their parental rights are still intact and they are involved, then you definitely want to make sure that the parents are part of any conversation you have with a school, and encourage the parents to be that primary. Just like if any of you have your own children, you're not necessarily going to sit and wait to see if there's a problem. If you know there's something going on with your child, you would notify the teacher or the school and say, hey, could you just keep an eye out for this issue? Or I've noticed that if my child can be sitting in, I'll use the example again of a bouncy chair, they're going to be more focused. Or if they can get up and go take a break if they need to, they're going to do better. So make sure if the parents still have their educational rights intact, that you include the parents. Having said that, there are a lot of parents that either want your assistance in advocating for those kids, or they're not as involved, unfortunately. And if that is the case, then I think it's a wonderful idea to be proactive. I can't tell you how many times I've met with teachers who say, I'm so glad I know who the point person is, because if you think about it, kids in foster care, they have foster parents oftentimes, or a caregiver. They have a DFS caseworker. They have a CASA. They have a child attorney. There's so many people, a lot of times they don't necessarily know should I go to anybody about this issue, or who do I go to? And so if you are going to the teacher or the school saying, hey, I'm the CASA, feel free to reach out to me if there are any issues, but here's what I've seen that seems to work well with my client, or things that have been successful in the past. Could we try some of these things? The other thing I will say is a lot of schools, public schools, will wait to see a child starting to slip behind before they're proactive. You can work with the child attorney and particularly the parents. If you think there's something going on fairly early on, you can ask the school affirmatively to run tests and to evaluate the child for a 504 plan or an IEP. And we can do another training on some of these issues, Lauren, if you want, to try to make sure that you're providing early intervention. But I don't think there is any harm or risk in you reaching out to the schools, but do that collectively, either with the parents or with the full child welfare team, so everyone's involved. And that way the teacher or whomever, the educator and administrator, know who they can reach out to. And in this world of where everybody emails, it's really easy to start an email chain where everyone who's involved in that child's life can be on one email together for the teacher administrator so that they know who to go to. I hope that helped answer some of the questions.
Thanks.
Eliza, this is Jody Cusick. I have a different sort of question. Let's just say you have a client who's an adolescent or even younger, and because they might not feel safe or for what other reason, they fib all the time. You really can't tell what they're telling you is what really is. What do you do? I mean, confronting them would probably make them feel even less safe. Not confronting them might make them feel, this is a great strategy. I can tell fibs all the time. So what do you do in a case like that where you have a client who isn't truthful about anything?
I would say two things. First, that's one of those situations where you really need to just keep building rapport with that child. It's very hard for a youth who has had the most important people in their lives, their parents or their caregivers, let them down. And that's really what this is that's the way that kids look at this is, I'm either not worthy or my parents let me down or there's something wrong with me. And that's why I'm in foster care. We have a lot of kids who feel that way and young people who feel that way. So the more you're there for them, even if they're lying, the more you're say, I'm sticking around no matter whether you're telling the truth or not, that's going to break that veneer at some point, and then you can have an authentic relationship. The other thing I would say though is if there are times where they're lying and they're blatant about it, I would still use that strength-based perspective to say things like, you know what, you have an amazing imagination, or you're really skilled at advocating for yourself, but I really want to see you do it in a way that I can help you. And so if you can be open and honest with me about what you want, I can do an even better job of helping you. So just kind of keep turning that around and keep reinforcing and reminding them that you're there to help them. You're not there to get in their way. But that sometimes just takes time. Lauren, I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, I think that is great. But Brian, I know you had your hand up to ask a question, but I want to add one quick question to Eliza. John first started by saying a child 3 to 4. At what age is the school district responsible for a child's education?
Age 3. So 0 to 3 child development watch. So if any of you represent kids who are under age 3, make sure this should be something you're always asking for, that child development watch does at least one assessment, if not at various routines, because that will tell you whether the child is developmentally on track. And then at age 3, if you're starting to see issues, their pediatrician said, you know, they should be talking a little bit more by now, or I'm not seeing progress in this area. That's when you can work with whoever holds educational rights, go to the school district and ask for evaluations.
Could I say something?
Well, can we have Brian's question first? Because he's been very patient, and then we'll get to you, Joanne.
It wasn't a question as much as you know, I work in education, and this is an area that my wife and I have both spent our careers in. You know, I was a former director of special education, and some of these issues are really quite complex from the educational perspective. I'm glad you mentioned 504, because, you know, we were thinking about special education, and there are a lot of things that schools can do under 504 that don't require an IEP, where kids can receive accommodations. And so that's another option. And early intervention is good, but one of the things that, you know, I'd just be conscious of, we were talking about issues of race, and one of the things that school districts, they're kind of getting pressure in two directions. You know, they're required to identify every child that has special needs. But when their numbers start showing disparate impact, meaning that African American or Hispanic students are being identified at a higher rate than white or other students, then they start getting penalized by the federal government. And so it's kind of like there's a tension, I think, right now when you're dealing with issues of race, because when we see like African American and Hispanic students experiencing higher rates of ACEs, and we know what the physical impact of that is on early development, you would kind of expect some of those kids to demonstrate a higher rate of disability, if associated with that. But then the district gets penalized for identifying it. So the districts are working really hard to do identifying kids accurately. And kind of one of the things I might have a small disagreement with you on is I also see a high rate of ADHD, kids identified with ADHD. And a lot of times I don't know that it's truly ADHD, but one of the reasons schools, you'll hear people pushing for the child to be medicated, because medication for ADHD, it's a stimulant drug, and it works. It has the same effect whether you have ADHD or you don't have ADHD. It's a stimulant. It helps people, even if you don't have ADHD, if you're having trouble focusing, people take stimulant drugs to help them focus. So the problem with it is, we kind of are, for kids of color, I think sometimes, their circumstances, they're not normal circumstances. They would be hard for any child to deal with. But we treat it medically. We tend to pathologize. And so, you get into this, but I've worked with kids who have experienced a lot of ACEs, and they have a lot of trouble focusing in the classroom. They're very hyperactive. They're and like a fidget toy or something like that, it might help briefly, but it doesn't help them sustain their attention, for longer than 10 or 15 minutes. So the teacher, it's really challenging for a teacher to have to deal with a child who's experienced a lot of ACEs, a lot of trauma in a classroom while they're trying to also teach 20, 25 other kids. I've done both. I've taught and I've been a psychologist. I've worked with, it's really hard. It's humbling, to do that. So I think you have to be sensitive to all of that. All that said, I'm very much an advocate for kids. And I think school districts have a responsibility. If a child has a disability, in particular, they have a legal right to the school district providing services to address their needs. So I totally support your idea or your point about being an advocate. Kind of early intervention is key, for any child with a disability. But for ADHD, there's not a blood test for ADHD. It's very subjective. There are a lot of kids, I think, that are identified with ADHD when it's not ADHD, it's trauma. And a stimulant med isn't going to address the trauma. You've really got to be these are complex decisions. And, hopefully every school, has a team in place that you can make a referral to. Either it's a Section 504 committee or an IEP team if you're suspecting a disability. The difference subtly is, in order for a child to receive special education or to qualify for an IEP, they have to need specially designed instruction. Some kids just need accommodations in the classroom, and that's a broader group, and those are kids who can be addressed with a 504 plan. So either way, if there are concerns, I think it's good to bring it forward to the IEP team or the 504 team or the school team. Schools, you can either do it with a big stick with a 504 plan or an IEP, or you can do it with a small stick a lot of schools have the same interest. They want to intervene early. So you're never wrong to bring it to the school's attention if you have concerns or questions. But I think it has to be done collaboratively, because sometimes the schools see things that we don't see. I've had parents dealing with a case recently where the child had a lot of problems. The mother didn't realize that the child could start school in pre-K. She waited until the child was 7 years old. It's a child with severe autism and missed out on all those early intervention services. So sometimes if you can just help them understand, sometimes there are cultural differences with immigrants in particular, who may not have had formal schooling in their home country. So sometimes they need you to kind of explain, we can ask for these services. So just some additional thoughts there.
Gotcha. Thanks, Brian. Joanne, did you want to say something?
I did.
Joanne, I think you froze on us. Joanne, if you just froze, maybe it'll unfreeze in a moment. Eliza, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay. Well, I'll say, Brian, you raise a lot of great points, and I will say I do a different kind of training for educators. I talk to them about universal things they could do in their classrooms to try to support all kids, because things that benefit kids who've experienced trauma also benefit kids who haven't experienced trauma. So things like creating a calm corner, making sure you give kids the chance to practice self-regulation, doing exercises that energize the brain and calm the brain. Those are all the kinds of things that are really important, and strategies that I think, unfortunately, a lot of teachers don't necessarily get when they're going through their education to see how that helps kids with trauma. If we have trauma-informed classrooms, we don't necessarily need 504 plans or IEPs for all the kids who've experienced trauma, just the ones who need specially designed instruction, because it's so much more rigorous and there are other components that need to occur before someone can be eligible.
Yeah, it's true. There's a lot of research that they call it social emotional learning, SEL now. And a lot of younger teachers do get that in their curriculum, but older teachers may not have been exposed to it. But you're right, all kids benefit from it. In fact, they found that kids who get that long-term get a 17% gain in their reading achievement, which is, so all kids benefit, and they all benefit. I mean, you don't normally see that kind of a gain in learning from, even if it's an intervention that focuses on reading. So you can see the benefit of it.
And I think it might have been Joyce who asked about self-care. I could be wrong, but the same holds true for kids, that if kids can learn mindfulness, breathing exercises, things that help you reset and pause early on, that's better for long-term academic outcomes. It reduces impulsivity. There are lots of benefits to both children and adults to have that brain reset. And I will say one thing about breathing that is phenomenal. It's an autonomic response, which means you do it whether you're thinking about it or not, hopefully, as long as you're a live, thriving human being. But it's the one system that you can control as well. So you can change your breathing to change how you're doing. So if you're anxious or you're in court and things are stressful, if you take slow inhales and slow exhales, that actually calms your body and your brain. So it's pretty powerful. And so those are also things that help with trauma. And so sometimes with clients I've had, if they're really out of sorts, I just say, let's just sit here for a minute and just breathe, and I'll count if you want to, or we'll just take a minute. And those are all the kinds of modeling things that kids see, and they can say, okay, I can trust this person because I'm in a safe environment and they're doing the same thing I'm doing. They're not just telling me what to do. We got a couple more minutes. Does anyone want to tell me if you either have any questions, comments, or anything you want to try?
I think, it's been a very informative presentation. And I do have a question. I always have gone into the classroom to visit the child in the classroom as long as the teacher's comfortable. And I don't spend a day there, but maybe half hour or just 45 minutes to see how the child functions in that environment. And it gives you some clue about how the teacher also functions in that environment. And I don't go in there with any, reason to evaluate a teacher, but I really just want to see how the child behaves. So I don't know if you think that's a good idea, and I've talked to the counselors in the schools, and also like what if they're going into third grade, who would be the best match for that child as far as teacher styles, because they vary and they're valid and they're different, but some teachers may react better to disruptive behaviors than others.
Here's one opinion I have. I think as long as you have a child that's verbal and maybe over kindergarten age, I think you should ask them, is it okay if I come see you in your classroom? Would you be willing to introduce me to your teacher? Or should I come see you in your foster home? Or if not there, would you like me to meet you in the Boys and Girls Club or something like that? I think giving kids a little bit of control and choice helps speed up building that rapport. So you may have some kids, I've had some clients who say, can you please come see me at school? I want to introduce you to my teacher. I want to come talk to you with my school counselor. And I have others who say, do not step foot in this school except for if there's a school meeting, because I don't want anybody knowing that I'm in foster care. So I think that's one of those times where you are the advocate for the child. Give that child some opportunity to help advocate for themselves, because that's a great lifelong skill that they can learn as well.
No, I never went unannounced, and the kids always knew when I was coming. In fact, they were Black, and one of the kids asked who I was, and he said, she's my grandmother. And it just was wonderful, actually.
Oh, Joanne's back. Joanne?
I don't know what happened. I'm sorry. I just wanted to say, in regard to the conversation we had about children telling lies, that lying is a learned behavior and it's based on fear. So sometimes just thinking about it that way helps you be a little more patient with a child who is telling you what they think you need to hear, not what necessarily they want to tell you. Makes it a little easier sometimes.
I love it. That's a strengths-based way of looking at it. That there's nothing, that there's not something wrong with that child. This is a survival or a coping skill.
Right.
All right, we got a couple more minutes. Are there any other questions or comments? Brian?
I wanted to make one more comment. The one of your points that I'm going to try, I'm glad you emphasized it, and it's, even though this is like an area that I have a lot of experience in, I still take the child's behavior personally, the triggers. And, it's like, why are, I get so, especially when kids who are very defiant or very challenging, like, I'm a nice guy. Why aren't they warming up to me? Why does it keep happening? And, and then I get angry, but it's like, I've got to always step back and remind myself, don't take it personally. This is how they're going through life. They're not doing it just with me. They're doing it with others too. And maybe I'm doing something that provokes it. So just trying to understand it and not take it personally. I'm going to try to continue working on that.
That's great. Brian, you seem like a really nice guy. And I would say even for young people who haven't experienced trauma, you hit 6th grade and the hormones start surging. And so it doesn't matter what you say or do when hormones are raging. Things are coming out of kids' mouths that maybe aren't always the kindest.
Do I
have great respect for middle school teachers.
I was working with a little guy recently who is he's in 4th grade, and he is so much energy and big class, a lot of kids, and he's constantly talking, constantly moving, constantly making comments. And afterwards, when I found out a little bit about the family situation, I thought, oh my God, that's all he knows. You know, he doesn't, that's all learned behavior. And, you know, it's for him, it's survival. You know, that's how he copes. And I thought, wow, you know, and I was taking it personally because I was trying to kind of help work with the teacher to get it down. But I realized, like, boy, it's really not about me at all.
Mm-hmm. But the more kids trust you, the more they can say to their brain, I'm safe. I can sit now and I can focus a little bit more.
Yeah, yeah.
And then think too about the records and the information we get about the kids that we're working with. We generally get a lot of records from Division of Family Services, maybe some from schools, but those are only incidences that the system knows about. So imagine all the trauma that may have occurred that we just don't have on a piece of paper. So I can only imagine that there's more. There's a lot more trauma.
Can I add something about the parents?
Yeah.
Okay, I don't know if you could hear me. My past, I was I did investigations before this, but before that, I was a parent aide and I did visitations. And what I noticed with a lot of the parents coming from that side is that they often had delays, or there was maybe they had an IEP or something like that. And 9 times out of 10, they're intimidated by the schools. They don't know what they're saying and it's not explained well. And so I think sometimes the parents, maybe they miss the meetings because they don't know what to do or they feel stupid in them. So that just kind of always is in the back of my mind of, you know, yes, they want to help their child, but maybe they don't know how to, maybe they're afraid of it. And they usually have had a lot of trauma themselves. And so I think, you know, going back to that, it's, you know, that's why the child is like that, because, you know, the history of the family. So, but just with all the school things, that just makes me think of that. Because when I was a parent aide, I attended a lot of the 504, the IEP meetings, and I think almost everyone, the parents, you know, were like, I don't know what they're saying, and they don't feel comfortable enough to speak up.
Jessica, that's a good point. So I have a question for Eliza and some of the CASAs that have worked in special ed. Is there a process that some schools utilize to communicate effectively with parents, where they're not speaking every sentence is in acronyms? Where it's like parent-friendly language, or not even parent-friendly, but just non-special education friendly?
I will say in my years of both teaching education law as a law professor and going to many, many IEPs, no, I will stop and say, can you stop speaking in acronyms, or can you explain that, please? Without trying to be contentious. I'm probably sounding a little pushier than I mean to, but yeah, I think it's a really unfortunate system because structurally it's not aligned to support families, because you have an hour to get through a massive document, and so they'll start talking about lots of acronyms, and unless someone is willing to stop and say, I don't know what that means, or can you explain that, that's where I think CASAs can play a huge role, because many of you have experience in the education system yourselves, or you can say, you know what, can you just go over that acronym, even if you know it, so that you're helping to support the family? Because I think a lot of child advocacy should really be considered family advocacy, especially if the permanency plan is reunification, that you're doing as much to help support this family as you are this child, because that's the plan, is to get this child back to their family as successfully as possible.
Yeah, Eliza, that's a good point. And I'm thinking for CASAs that don't have special education experience, like if you're attending an education meeting and you don't understand the acronym, the parent probably doesn't either. So a very simple thing you can do, even if you ask it for every sentence, is can you please explain what that acronym means? Not only what the words stand for, but the purpose of it. So sometimes I find that acronyms they say what the words are, and this isn't just for education, this is also the child welfare system as a whole. You can tell me that a TDM is a team decision-making meeting, but I don't really know what that means. Like, what are you deciding? What's the team? Who's the team? So, if you have questions about what this particular acronym is, then I think that's a very simple thing CASAs can do, is ask questions to just define what that acronym is.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions or thoughts? Eliza, I like your 10 minutes or 10 seconds, 7 seconds to think about it, 3 minutes to, or 3 seconds to find the mute button. So that's what I'm gonna steal from you today.
It helped me when I started teaching in the pandemic last year with my law students, because I would ask questions and I'd like, nobody's paying attention. Why isn't anyone answering? Oh, it's because they have to process, and then they all got to find their mute buttons.
Yeah, so true. So thank you. If there are no further questions, thank you everybody for attending today. And Eliza, thank you so very much for doing this presentation. It was incredibly helpful, and I think every single CASA will absolutely use it.
Thank
Very
you.
good.
And
Thank you.
feel free to reach out. I'm still around. Like I said, I'm still a child attorney, and Lauren is a dear friend. So you can always ask her if there's something that, very few things stump Lauren, but if they do, she's always welcome to reach out to me.